Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. My name is Eric Gastfriend, and I'm the co-founder of Harvard University Affected Altruism Student Group. We work to encourage students to think about how they can do the most good given limited time, energy, and resources. We're active at all of the Harvard grad schools. We organize talks like this one. We also organize a philanthropy advisory fellowship where we recruit Harvard grad students to help philanthropists and foundations research charities and think strategically about how they can do the most good with their charitable dollars. And I think some of you are participating in it in this semester, which is great. And it'll continue next semester, so we encourage you to apply over the summer. I've passed out a little feedback form, so if you guys want to give us your email address, we'll add you to our email list. And we'll also let you know about new events, and you can let us know what you thought about this event. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Professor Alan Fenwick is the director of the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative and professor of tropical parasitology at Imperial College in the UK. Earlier, he worked on schistosomiasis research and control in Tanzania, Sudan, and Egypt. Professor Penwick has pioneered the control of neglected tropical diseases in Africa and regularly returns to the 8 countries where Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, also called SCI, is active. SCI is one of the top-ranked charities by GiveWell, which is a leading charity evaluator. The organization has delivered over 100 million treatments for neglected tropical diseases and is one of the most highly cost-effective charities in the world. With that, I'd like to introduce Alan Penwick. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Looks like I might be here for another 3 days looking at the weather. I'm hoping my plane has left London, but where it's going to end up, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Eric, for organising. I talked over in Cambridge last night. The title that he's given me is a little bit large, and to deal with 6 or 7 diseases in, I think, 45 minutes is going to be a bit of a challenge. I might run over a couple of slides without talking about them, because I want to do it to give the presentation and finish by 1:30. So please forgive me if I have leapt over them, and we could perhaps talk afterwards if you're not rushing off to another class. So in this presentation I'm going to talk about what the neglected tropical diseases are, what their importance is, so that you can realize just how many people tend to be infected and what the symptoms and consequences of these infections are. And then there's a number of them that are receptive to what we call mass drug administration, which means that we don't do diagnosis and treatment. We determine the prevalence of the various diseases by district, and we just treat everybody because the drugs are safe, effective, inexpensive, or even free. And the free bit is the role of the pharmaceutical industry. Everybody knows the pharmaceutical industry are horrible, greedy, money-making organizations. But for us, they're the good guys, because they, as part of their corporate responsibility, donate the drugs for us to treat people who can't afford to buy them. And then I'll summarize where we are today in terms of treatment compared to those who need treatment, and then say, are we really heading for elimination? Because the World Health Organization has actually asked the member states to think about elimination of a number of these diseases by 2020. So the whole first premise is about 1 in 6 of the human population who actually live on less than $2 a day, which is a pretty horrific thought. And the point is that they're poor, and so they get these tropical diseases. And they've got the tropical diseases, so they're poor. It's a vicious cycle of poverty and sickness. Now, the reason I'm talking to you today is because I'm one of the few people in the world who can spell the names of these diseases and actually pronounce them. So I've divided them into 4 groups in a way. There's those in black and those in red, and the ones I'm going to concentrate on today are the ones in red, because those 7 are the diseases which are very, very prevalent and yet could be treated because we have the drugs which only need to be given out once a year, and then we could head towards elimination. The protozoan diseases, sleeping sickness and Chagas and Leishmaniasis, I'm going to leave out. We don't have good drugs for them, and we certainly don't have drugs which are cheap enough and safe enough to give to people who aren't infected. Borrelia ulcer and leprosy are getting really very much under control now. Trachoma is the only non-worm infection I'm going to talk about. So how many people are infected? Well, in Africa, probably 2/3 or 3/4 of the population in Africa have got one or other or more than one of these diseases. And remember that people in the big cities, in Cairo, in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, probably don't have these infections because they're very much infections of rural poor, people who don't have access to water supply and sanitation. As you can see from this, the 3rd one down, schistosomiasis, which is my favourite disease because I've worked on it for at least, well, too many years. And almost 90% of the cases of schistosomiasis in the world, and there are well over 200 million of them, are found in sub-Saharan Africa. The others, even though there are many people in Africa infected, are actually more global in their distribution. So hookworm, ascaris and trichuris, which are intestinal helminths, are found all over the world. Trachoma, which is preventable blindness caused by chlamydia, is also found outside of Africa. Onchocerciasis, river blindness, sleeping sickness and Guinea worm are currently pretty much confined to Africa. So I'm going to talk about each of the diseases quickly. I have no idea what your backgrounds are, but I'm hoping that it might be, if not too boring, if I look at the life cycles. If you haven't heard of them, then you need to know, and if you have heard of them, this, I hope, will be a little bit of a refresher. So schistosome worms, they're about 1 centimetre in length, male and female worms, as you can see there. The male is the dominant, big, strong one, and the female is grasped by the male, and they live in constant copulation for about 20 years in the blood vessels of the human host, either around the bladder or around the intestine. And the female worms lay eggs. These are horrible looking eggs, and they cause a lot of damage. The first damage they cause is because they have to get out of the human body in order to complete the life cycle, and they use that spine to rupture capillary tubes and get into the bladder, or capillary tubes around the intestine and to get into the intestine. But it's a pretty random process. So maybe 50% of the eggs escape and take with them blood as a result of the vessels that they've ruptured. But the other 50% get trapped, either in the bladder wall or in the intestine wall, or more likely they get washed to the liver, where they are trapped because the liver acts as a filter and they've nowhere to go. Once the eggs die, as they do, then the human body recognizes them and forms little tiny scars. So over 20 years, as you can imagine, if you've got quite a few of these worms, you get more and more scars, and as a result you get fibrosis of the liver, fibrosis of the bladder, which eventually leads to bladder cancer and to hepatosplenomegaly, and people will die. Like many of the parasites, schistosomiasis has a life cycle. If one of you is infected, it doesn't matter how friendly or intimate you are with the person next to you, it's not an infectious disease. The only way people can get infected is by being in fresh water, because the eggs which pass out in the urine and the stool actually have to reach fresh water, and if they do, they hatch. The larva which has hatched from the egg attacks a snail, and each species of schistosome has its own specific snail, and having reached the right snail, it takes over the snail's body, and there's a massive asexual reproduction. A little bit later in life, the snail will start shedding the next larva about a month later. That's called a cercaria, and that is the most incredible creature. That larva can penetrate unbroken human skin of anybody who is in the water. It then sheds its tail, migrates around the human body, covering itself with human cells so that it's like a Harry Potter invisibility cloak, and the body can't kill it. It reaches the liver, grows to maturity, the male and female pair up, and the cycle starts again. Over 250 million people are infected throughout the world, some in China. However, it is pretty much under control in most of China now, some in Brazil and in the Caribbean. But as I said earlier, nearly 90% of the infections are actually in Africa, and not surprisingly, knowing how poor, how rural, and how overpopulated it is, Nigeria tops the list with the number of people who are in need of treatment. But as you can see, according to the size of the country, there are many, many people in each country in Africa, because all fresh water is unsafe as far as schistosomiasis is concerned. So what are the health consequences? Well, the very early consequences, and it's children who tend to get infected because of their behavior, they suffer from gross hematuria, which is blood in the urine and blood in the stool, and malnutrition and anemia because of the blood loss and the fact that the worms live on blood, and to some extent growth retardation. In the medium term, there's an increased susceptibility to other infections. Females get female genital schistosomiasis because of the involvement of the worms living close to the genital area, and I'll talk about that later. And then there are the chronic health problems that get worse and worse as time goes by if people aren't treated. Inflammation, fibrosis, as I've mentioned. And the late stages are really life-threatening. Bladder cancer, portal hypertension, hematemesis caused by blockage of the liver. This is a picture I took of 3 children that I picked out of a school in Niger. This school had never been treated when I visited it, and 80% of the children were producing urine that looked like that. I mean, that really is scary, and how they're even healthy enough to go to school in that position is a wonder. And with Schistosoma mansoni, which is the intestinal form of schistosomiasis, this individual has a completely blocked liver, and the chances are that he would live not very long after this photo was taken. Over the years, and schistosomiasis has only really been known for 150 years, and its life cycle was only elucidated just 100 years ago when the snail hosts were implicated. We've had a number of attempts to find drugs to treat them, particularly based in Egypt, Sudan, and Uganda. But the drugs, one by one, have fallen by the wayside as they've proved not to be specific, not to be effective, and in some cases to have caused some rather nasty side effects. But since 1990, we have a drug. It's almost a wonder drug. It's called Praziquantel. It's active against all the species, but it's only effective against the adult worms because it strips and affects the external tegument of the worm, which means that the human body then recognizes the worm and will kill it. It's given by weight, and it's very difficult to actually weigh children on sandy floors in schools and in villages. And so what we've done is we've done a correlation between height and weight, and when we're treating with this mass drug administration, we have a pole which is marked off in terms of half tablets, and we line the kids up and say, you're 2.5 tablets tall, and the teacher who's sitting there with the tin of tablets gives them 2.5 tablets, they swallow them, and it only has to be done once a year. I mentioned female genital schistosomiasis, and this is something which is only relatively recently being realized, that the eggs of the schistosome which are around the bladder, as I say, many of them get out into the bladder and out through the urine, but sadly, quite a lot of eggs get deviated somehow into the cervix of females, and they cause lesions. And these lesions have been linked to increased HIV. So that in Mozambique, Malawi, South Africa and Tanzania, where quite sadly really young girls, their first sexual experience is often with older men who may be infected with HIV, and we found that the expected mathematical prediction of the number of young girls who would be infected with HIV is much higher in areas where there's urinary schistosomiasis. And so it's essential that we get proactively and treat young girls before these lesions develop. Because the Praziquantel treatment kills the worms, but it's not going to do anything to replace and repair those lesions. Now, even more recently, we've realized that even younger children are getting exposed to schistosomiasis, because when the mothers go down to the lakes, the rivers, the ponds to do their domestic chores, they take their babies with them, obviously, and they sit them in the water, either in a polythene bucket or just in the water to keep them cool and let them play. And of course, the worms in smaller bodies are much more likely to cause morbidity and damage to particularly the liver. But can we treat those preschool-age children? I've mentioned Praziquantel, but those Praziquantel tablets, sadly, are manufactured. They are very large and they're incredibly bitter. When we treat children, we make them swallow the tablets, not chew them. But of course, with infants, you can't do that. We have tried crushing the tablets and giving them with sugar or honey, but it's not a very satisfactory way of reaching a large number of people. So a consortium is now developing a pediatric formulation, which is a smaller pill, and they've somehow managed to remove the evil taste. And they've already reached phase 2 trials, and we're very hopeful that we will be able to have this new formulation available in a year or so. So the policy that we use, I'm an opportunist. Treating the school children is easy. We've got a captive audience. We know that if we go into a school and do an examination of 30 kids, if we find 3 kids infected, the diagnosis is not particularly sensitive, so we reckon that at least twice or 3 times that many children will actually have the infection, and we just treat everybody. The Praziquantel, as I told you, is incredibly safe. There are virtually no side effects, and it will deworm the children as well. I'm going to quickly go on to the other neglected tropical diseases. This is an amazing one, Onchocerciasis, which causes river blindness. Now, this particular worm lives in a nodule under the skin, male and female, but instead of laying eggs, this particular worm gives birth to live larvae. And the live larvae circulate around the skin, waiting to be picked up by a simulium fly when it next bites. And the simulium fly breeds in fast-moving water and rivers in Africa. Now, the larva that's circulating around the skin causes the most incredible unpleasant itching, and people scratch them so badly, it's amazing to me that they can even sleep. But what's even more worse is that they cross the retina. And if you have a long-term infection with Onchocerciasis, you will irreversibly go blind. And the extent is such. This is a map of about 10 countries in West Africa, and this is a survey done in 1974. And every village with a black dot had over 60% of people infected. And over the age of 40, 50% of everybody over the age of 40 was blind. This is in 1970. The only way they could think of in those days to treat and to save the blindness was to spray all the rivers with DDT and try and kill the flies. And every river was sprayed twice a year. Now, the environmentalists said, quite rightly, you're poisoning the water. You're killing loads of other things. But the people who were nearly blind said, yes, but it's saving the next generation from going blind. So it's quite a difficult choice to make. But fortunately, that choice was taken away in 1985 when William Campbell, who actually got the Nobel Prize this year for his work on neglected tropical diseases, discovered ivermectin, or Mectizan, working for Merck in America, and he found that actually, if we could give a dose of Mectizan to anybody who's infected with Onchocerciasis, it would sterilize the female worm. So the adult worms don't particularly do any damage to the people they're infected. It's the larvae that do the damage. So if these worms are sterile, there will be no larvae, and there'll be no itching, and there'll be no blindness. And if we can go back to this map and look at the results in 2002, thanks to all the treatments with Mectizan, nobody virtually is infected. There is still a danger of infection, but virtually nobody is blind today as a result of river blindness, which is a miraculous result. However, nobody could afford to buy the Mectizan that William Campbell had discovered. And so the CEO of Merck, a man called Roy Vegler, decided that this was the first major corporate responsibility of a pharmaceutical company, and he went to WHO and he said, everybody who lives in an endemic area in West Africa, I will give a free donation to every year for as long as is needed. And today, nearly 30 years later, Mectizan is still given out once a year to everybody who lives in an Onchocerciasis endemic area. And the good news is that it's mostly an African disease, but there were foci in South America, but they've virtually all been eliminated. Colombia and Ecuador are now free. Brazil and Venezuela, I believe they are free. They've gone 2 years without any new infection, and they're waiting to, with Mexico and Guatemala, to actually have elimination verified by the World Health Organization. I'm going to move on quite quickly to lymphatic filariasis, which is another worm disease, rather like Onchocerciasis, except that instead of living in nodules, the worms actually live in the lymph glands. The sad result of that is that because they live there, they block the lymph glands, which stops the flow of lymph and causes secondary infections in the lower regions of the body because lymph cannot drain away. This is not just an African disease. There's massive infection in the Indian subcontinent and in the islands of the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so there are an estimated 1.4 billion people at risk of infection, and 40 million people throughout the world have some sort of symptoms like that. And it's a worm, as I say, that lives in the lymphatics. How do we treat this one? Well, in the 1990s it was realized they tried Mectizan to sterilize the worms, but they found that they actually have to give Mectizan and albendazole, or DEC and albendazole, in order to sterilize the worms. Now, if the worms are sterilized, we can stop transmission, because the mosquitoes will not get infected because there won't be any larvae. But unlike Onchocerciasis, sterilizing the worms doesn't do any good to the individuals who are infected, because it's the adult worms which actually cause the problem. And so we need case management. And again, a relatively recent realization is that the use of soap and water and washing those swollen legs twice a day over a period of 3 months, the secondary infections will be cleared up, and many people, their legs will go back to very near a normal size. And obviously, as you can imagine, women with legs, as we saw, are terribly stigmatized. Now, in the case of schistosomiasis, there's that terrible thing that happens to women, but with lymphatic filariasis, sadly, it's the men who suffer, because they can have, again, a collection of fluid in the scrotum, which can lead to the most horrific pictures. There are even worse pictures of this, of people carrying their scrotum around in a wheelbarrow. and there are an awful lot of people infected. I gave a talk to a Rotary Club in Africa some time ago, and I showed this picture, and one of the Rotarians put his hand up and said, but I lived in Niger for a long time, I never saw anybody like that. And I did explain to him that people aren't exactly going to go around flashing proudly their disfigurement. And he said, well, what can they do about it? And the truth is that it's a very simple operation, providing that you've got clean conditions and a surgeon who knows what he's doing. And so this guy gave me $250,000 and said, go and treat 2,500 men. And so we went into Niger and we set up a system of operations. And we set up a list of people who needed the operation and found there were 8,000 men in Niger alone with this condition. And that particular gentleman was operated on, and as you can see, 3 months later, he looked a lot more normal. He had a smile on his face. I don't have a picture of his wife. She probably had a smile on her face as well. But anyway, at least you could imagine that he would be a happier person. This slide, I'm afraid, I did not develop. It's developed by GSK. You can't read it, and I apologize for that, so I will have to read it for you. But basically, it's demonstrating that GSK produce now 1 billion tablets of albendazole every year, and they give them away. So for lymphatic filariasis, which is the mosquito-borne I've just been shown, they are supplying tablets to 61 countries. And they have already donated 5 billion tablets since the year 2000. This year, 700 million people will receive free albendazole and either mectazan or DAC in order to stop the transmission of lymphatic filariasis. When they first made the donation, they said, we're not going to donate albendazole for deworming children, even though it's very good for deworming children. But in 2012, they changed their minds when they completed this factory, and so they were able to donate 600 million tablets of albendazole for deworming in areas where there wasn't lymphatic filariasis. And already 55 countries have been supplied with tablets. So GSK have been the really good guys for us, and they really have made a difference in lymphatic filariasis and deworming. So we've been treating for many years now in some countries. Can we stop? Now with lymphatic filariasis, the mathematics is relatively simple. The adult worms only live for 6 years. So if we can treat everybody in the population, infected or not, for 7 years, in theory, no mosquitoes should become infected, no transmission, and the lymphatic filariasis adult worm should die out. And we've actually done that in a number of countries. Not very many yet. So with lymphatic filariasis, we are actually stopped any further treatment in the Gambia and in Malawi last year. Burkina Faso, Niger and Mali are scheduled to stop this year, which is just as well because there's civil war in all 3 of the countries and it would be very difficult to continue anyway. But as you can see down here, there are a number of countries which have never yet reached full national coverage, and so it's at least 5 or 6 years before they will be able to stop. As far as Onchocerciasis is concerned, we've increased the treatments recently from once a year to twice a year, and we're very hopeful that within the next 3 years we can stop Onchocerciasis treatment and call it eliminated in Niger, Senegal, Malawi, Burundi, Chad, Mali, Benin, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone and Togo. That's quite an achievement, and it will reduce the number of tablets that are needed to treat everybody. Let's quickly go on to the soil-transmitted helminths, the worms. These are, you've probably heard of the worm wars. There's been a great discussion about whether it's actually worthwhile treating children with intestinal worms. And I'm going to demonstrate to you why I think it is. This little girl has a bit of a swollen tummy, and so before the albendazole was donated, I used to buy it for 2 cents a tablet from a generic company in India. And if we treat this girl with 1 tablet of albendazole, this is the worms that she produced. Now, you can't tell me that it isn't worth treating somebody who has got that many worms inside them. Now, I put up the number of people who are infected. The number of people who are infected and have heavy worm burdens is probably only about 10%. But that's still 80 million people, 80 million children around the world who have heavy infections and need treating. So I'm a great advocate of whenever we treat anybody for anything, we're reaching out to the population and to the schools. It doesn't cost anything to add an albendazole and deworm those children. And if we can do it, if we get there early, before they're stunted and suffering from malnutrition, as this picture shows, within 3 months of treatment, they will rejoin the normal growth curves. The next one, and we're reaching the end of my run around neglected tropical diseases, is blinding trachoma, which is very much a preventable disease. If we had a fly running around this room, I wouldn't be able to lecture because we'd all be irritated if it landed on us. But children who live in areas where they haven't got very much fresh water, their faces are sticky, and they will get used to these flies. They get desensitized. And these flies carry a chlamydia infection which causes conjunctivitis. And after a number of conjunctivitis episodes, the eyelashes turn down instead of up. And they scratch the cornea very painfully and cause people to go blind. And yet, a single dose of azithromycin once a year to the community will stop all trachoma, and it could easily be eliminated. If it's too late, we need surgery. And I took this picture in a clinic in Burundi. Burundi has 11 million people and 3 ophthalmologists. But one of the ophthalmologists is a fantastic person, and every Wednesday he goes to a different health centre in the country, and he operates on 10 or 15 people in order to alleviate their blindness. So the drug that we use for trachoma is zithromycin, and it's produced by Pfizer. And this is a Pfizer slide. I hope you can read it, but it says that 33 countries have been supported, current and past, but there are 51 countries that need to be reached. But 7 countries have already used zithromycin for 3 to 5 years and eliminated trachoma. This year, they are, 2015, they have agreed to donate 115 million doses, which are being delivered throughout the world, and they've already, since the beginning of the program, donated 444 million doses, which have been shipped and used. Now, the last parasite I'm going to mention is Dracunculiasis, or Guinea worm, and this is a fantastic parasite with an amazing life cycle. It's only people can only get infected by swallowing, drinking water which have got little larvae inside them, water fleas, and the water fleas are infected with a guinea worm larva. If that happens, the larva is released in the stomach, and the larva grows to be a guinea worm. And a guinea worm is 1 meter in length. It's incredibly painful because what it's got to do to reproduce is actually get its eggs into the water. And it does that by forming a blister around the lower part of the body. The blister burns, so people go to the water to cool their leg down, and out come all the eggs from this worm. 30 years ago, something like 2 million people were suffering from this hugely debilitating disease. But thanks actually mostly to the efforts of ex-President Jimmy Carter and the Carter Center, he has really promoted the removal of guinea worm. I say today less than 200 cases globally. I haven't upgraded this slide, I should have done, because last year there were only 22 cases in the whole world. Jimmy Carter, bless him, is recovering from cancer, and he's about 88 years old, and his ambition is to see the end of Guinea Worm before he goes. And I think it's a bit of a race against time, so let's all hope, for his sake, that the last 22 cases are cured. But how are we going to cure them? We don't have any treatment, and the only way we can do it is by having really good publicity. So anybody who finds that they've got a little worm coming out of them goes to a health centre, and what happens is they tie the worm around a matchstick, and they very, very slowly and carefully pull that worm out. If the worm snaps or dies, then the people would probably also suffer an anaphylactic shock, because they would have a rotting half worm inside them. And so it's really important that this removal of the worm is done very slowly. It's a very rare piece of film, this now, because, as I say, there are only about 20 cases left, most of them in the southern Sudan, 1 or 2 in Mali, in Chad, and I think there was 1 last year in Ethiopia as well. But as you can see, it's quite a long worm, and it's got a long way to go to get it out. And there it is. They didn't get it all out, as you saw, but they certainly got most of it out. Neglected tropical diseases. Why are they called neglected? Because they are totally neglected. In the year 2000, apart from the Onchocerciasis program I described, not a single dose against any of these diseases was being delivered in Africa. But fortunately for us, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals came out, and we were able to use this as advocacy to get governments and foundations to try and support our efforts to treat all the people. Millennium Development Goal number 1, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. How on earth are you going to get rid of extreme poverty and hunger when 1 billion people are infected with worms which are eating the little bit of food that the children are being given to eat? How are you going to achieve universal primary education if kids who should be fit and well have got these parasites inside them which are weakening them, making them malnourished, and giving them anemia? They haven't even the strength to go to school, and if they do get there, they probably go to sleep. How are you going to reduce child mortality and improve maternal health when women who are infected with these worms have all got anemia? Because anemia is the major constraint to good birth, and is the major contributor to a poor birth outcome. And so we got 4 of the 8 Millennium Development Goals which will never be reached unless we treat these diseases. And that's helped us. We now have the support of these pharmaceutical industries. I've mentioned Merck and Mectizan. I've mentioned GlaxoSmithKline and their donation of albendazole. Johnson & Johnson I haven't mentioned, but they have a deworming drug as well, mebendazole, and they treat 200 million. Pfizer I've mentioned with zithromycin. Novartis actually donate the drug for leprosy. Eisai, DEC for LF, and Merck in Germany, who are relatively late on the scene, this year will donate 250 million tablets of Praziquantel for us to treat 100 million children in Africa who have schistosomiasis. In the past, the countries have had to order their Praziquantel and their albendazole and DEC, etc., from the companies. But what we've tried to do now, and this is the first year we've done it, is to consolidate so that the countries only need to fill in one form, but they have to justify what they will do with the drugs that they're ordering. So what do we do in order to control and how to efficiently use the drugs that we've got? We've got to map the distribution of each of the disease in each country. We've got to persuade the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education that the drugs are worth delivering. We've got to find stakeholders, NGOs, who will help the rather poor capacity of the Ministries of Health to deliver the drugs. And so we have to work out and get acceptable national plans. We have to order the right number of drugs, and while those drugs are being delivered, and there's often a 6-month delay, we have to persuade train people who are going to deliver the drugs, either the school children or community volunteers, and we have to provide health education material. Then when the drugs arrive, we have to clear them and distribute them. But nevertheless, we can do all that for 50 cents per person per year. It's an exceedingly cost-effective intervention. These are just quickly some of the maps. The ones on the left show all the schools that have got a prevalence of over 50% of intestinal worms in Uganda and Tanzania and Burundi. Schistosomiasis on the right is much more patchy because it depends on the distribution of snails. As I said, in the year 2000, there was no schistosomiasis treatment in sub-Saharan Africa, nor was there any lymphatic filariasis or intestinal worms. But as a result of the program in Egypt from 1988 to 2000, which really hit schistosomiasis on the head, we were able to use those results to go to Bill Gates and suggest to him, with his, what was then, new foundation, that in addition to supporting childhood vaccination and malaria, why wouldn't he support schistosomiasis? And this is where the SCI was founded, because he was very kind and gave me $34 million to start the SCI. Over the years, we've increased our, because our results were so good, we've increased our support, and now today we're in almost half of the countries in Africa which have schistosomiasis. We're actually active in 17 countries. We've treated 120 million cases, and we're treating from now on at least 50 million children every year. In Ethiopia, which is one of the last countries we've gone into, we mapped the area 2 years ago. We started and we found that we needed to treat 10 million children every year. At the beginning of last year, we managed to treat nearly 3 million. In November, we were able to increase that to treat 6.4 million. And in 2016, the whole country, every child who is infected with schistosomiasis will receive treatment, and another 20 million will be dewormed in areas where there's no schistosomiasis. Same in Madagascar. This is our next project. The only problem is we only have enough money to treat half of Madagascar. So if anyone in their pockets happens to have a check for $1 million, we'd be very pleased to treat the other half of Madagascar. And then the big question is, can we do the same in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Nigeria? And I must emphasize again, it is the cheapest, most cost-effective intervention we can do. We have money from USAID, we have money from the British government, but it's probably about 1/3 of what we need. And we have a few other implementation donors. Particularly I'd like to mention Giving What We Can and GiveWell, who have looked at deworming and looked at schisto and looked at malaria, and they recommend that they are the most cost-effective ways of doing treatment. And SCI has been, for the last 5 years, one of the top 3 named cost-effective charities. So that's something I'm quite proud of. There used to be nobody doing them, but look at the number of people, the number of organizations, the number of donors, the number of pharmaceutical companies who are now involved. In fact, our biggest embarrassment is neglected tropical diseases are not as neglected as they used to be. Elimination. I'm going to stop now because I want to leave 5 minutes for questions. We've got a little bit of innovation. Do you know what these kids are doing? In their school playground, they're going around a roundabout and they're actually pumping water up. So we've got a few ideas, but the Gates Foundation insists that every year we have a scorecard where we get towards elimination. And I have to say that sadly, the only one in red, which is a poor achiever, is schistosomiasis, because the Praziquantel donation was so late in coming. And at the moment, we're still only treating about 20 to 25% of the people who need to be treated. With the treatment that we have, we can very nearly reach elimination in all these NTDs. But to get there, we're going to have to give water and sanitation. And that is the big key. So 700 million people are being treated. We're saving a lot of lives. We're improving the quality of the life of everybody we reach. We have more Praziquantel than we have money to deliver. We need water and sanitation. And if we can do that, we'll eliminate schistosomiasis when I retire in 2030. Thank you very much.
So we can open it up to questions.
At Eric's insistence, I said I would finish and leave 5 minutes for questions, but after anyone who wants to leave, can do so. Eric?
Do you have any positions open for public health students?
Actually, SCI has 3 advertisements out at the moment. We are in 17 countries. We are expanding. And what we have is a program manager who is responsible for 2 countries. So we have currently 8 project managers. 2 of them are going on maternity leave next week. And so we're looking for somebody to come and work in their places. And then the other thing is that, and I hope you realize that I could have talked for 3 hours on what I'm doing rather than less than 1, is that our relationship with Giving What We Can and GiveWell is really very important. We don't do any fundraising ourselves, they do it for us. But what we have to do is get a communications person. We're advertising at the moment for someone who is good at communication, and we want to make that person responsible for dealing with GiveWell literally on a week-by-week basis, so that they are even more convinced that we're doing a good job, and perhaps reach out to other foundations and donors that we don't even know about yet. So there are. And the other thing, if anyone's interested in free in the first week of July, we run a global health course, a very inexpensive 1-week global health course at Imperial College at St Mary's, which has proved to be very popular. We only have 70 seats, and I think it's in the next week that it's opening up for people to register. Anyway, that's the other thing. So, yes?
Yes?
Yeah.
So it's really, I'm interested in the pharmaceutical side of it. So the drugs that you are getting donations from, were they developed to treat these diseases, or they were developed separately?
No, they were developed really for the veterinary market.
Okay.
So, I mean, you know, while they are the good guys, there is no doubt, I don't know whether any of you have got dogs or cats, but if you have, you probably spend $20 a year at least deworming your dogs and cats. It's the same drug that I was buying for 2 cents. So the profit margins are quite good, but what they are doing is ploughing back some of the profit margins into reaching out to people who can't afford to buy those drugs. So it's a good balance. It's a bit like Bill Gates. I mean, you know, if he charged half the price for his Outlook or whatever, Microsoft, then he wouldn't have had enough money or as much money to give away. But as it is, he has gone into philanthropy in a really big way, so he's put some money to good use.
So I know a lot of you have class now, so we'll end it officially here, but if you want to stay around and ask questions, please feel free to do that.
And if any of you could arrange for the snow to stop so that the airport can open, that'd be very nice. Thank you very much.